Now to the U.S. state of Oklahoma, where the city of Tulsa is marking the centenary of what's been called the worst single incident of racial violence in U.S. history. In 1921, a white mob killed about 300 people and burned its way through the city's Greenwood neighborhood. Greenwood was at the time one of the largest and wealthiest black communities in the country. On Monday, local politicians spoke and prayed at a service to commemorate the unknown victims of the massacre. President Joe Biden also issued a proclamation to remember the tragedy. He's set to visit Tulsa on Tuesday. The story of Tulsa has only really become known in recent years, as U.S. historians have largely ignored the incident.
The soldiers were coming in to run the rebels out, and everybody was running and hiding and trying to get away. I don't know. It's just a big mess. And I remember I think I got up from the house and we took us down to the fairground to have food and everything after that. And it was quite some kind of mess.
Events have been held in Tulsa to mark that 100th anniversary of the massacre. Residents have also shared their memories and feelings about the tragedy. Hendrix Brandy reports.
With a simple snip, officials in Tulsa unveil the Pathway to Hope, a new pedestrian walkway that symbolically links the Greenwood neighborhood with the rest of the city. That connection, many argue, was severed when an interstate was built right through the community half a century ago. It is part of Tulsa's rich and sometimes tragic history that's gradually come to light.
We're seeing not just locally but nationally that the sharing of this history is really resonating with people.
Tulsa resident Vanita Cooper points to the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, in which hundreds of black Tulsans died at the hands of white attackers in a violent rampage that's now being remembered exactly 100 years later.
Our role really was, it's time for the world to know about this. What can we do to elevate this?
Phil Armstrong says that's how the centennial commemoration he helped organize got started 6 years ago, before details of the massacre became more widely known.
Now it's where do we go from here? And it's about healing, it's about truth-telling.
It wasn't something that she liked to talk about.
William Gibbs' mother was 15 years old when she fled the white mob in Greenwood.
She looked back and saw houses being burned and people being killed. So it definitely affected her.
Virtually all of the victims of the Tulsa Race Massacre remain unaccounted for today. The attempt to find and identify their remains began only fairly recently. Reparations for massacre survivors has yet to take place.
This is a moment now where the eyes of the world are on Tulsa. It's a time to teach them about the massacre, but also to teach them about this incredible Greenwood neighborhood.
The culture of the neighborhood has been on full display over the past few days. This festival along Greenwood Avenue, once known as Black Wall Street, is one of many events taking place this week around the city. The Greenwood Rising History Museum, right down the block, is on the verge of opening too. Its focus, the massacre, as well as broader issues.
Like police community relations, Black Lives Matter, mass incarceration, educational deficits, healthcare disparities, and on and on and on.
Offering a through line between history and the present at a time when racial tensions are never far from the surface. Security at a Greenwood church has been tight. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security has warned that the commemoration could be targeted by white supremacists.
It's a shame that people don't grow from what they experience or what they see. Progress has been made, I'll give it that, but we have so much further to go.
To accomplish that, Gibbs says learning from the past at gatherings like these is key.
I think it's always good to know where you came from to get a better feel for where you're going and how you're going to get there.
That uncertain path to hope is one that Tulsa and many other cities in the U.S. are now traveling.
We're joined now by Atiba Marjoon from Washington, D.C. He's the president and founder of research group Party Politics. Mr. Marjoon, it's great to have you with us on Global Watch. Now, as we heard, the Tulsa Massacre, this is a part of history that wasn't so widely known until recently, in recent years. So how does it live on in the memory of Black Americans?
Well, Black Americans have, for a long time been saying that there's an issue with systemic racism, and Tulsa is just another example of that. And it has taken a long time for people to become aware of it, even African Americans, because a lot of it was either whitewashed, and some African Americans actually tried to forget that it happened and didn't want to burden their children and grandchildren with this. But this is an episode in American history that is a nasty episode, unlike so many other episodes that have happened in American history as it relates to racial tension. And when we see things, for instance, we just had mark the 1 year of the murder of George Floyd, that the things that we have been talking about in this country that have been plaguing us, that have felt as if there was a knee to our neck, this is just another one of those examples. But it's one of those things in pieces of history that it's good for us to be talking about, because we can't reconcile the past without really knowing what happened, and if we want to move forward into the future.
And how has the experience of people of color in the U.S. changed since the massacre?
Well, I think if you look back just 50 plus years ago to the marching that happened in places like Selma or the March on Washington, where there were majority African Americans that were marching. When you look at an incident, for instance, last year with George Floyd, and you see the marches that occurred, not just in the United States, but across the world, there was a multitude of ethnicities that came together, and nationalities linking arms together, speaking out against police brutality, particularly that against African Americans. So we've made progress, and there are a lot of allies, but there's still a lot of stubbornness and a lot of things that need to be done from a government standpoint in terms of policy. I know there's a conversation about reparations, but there's far more to this, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that we cannot continue to erase these things from textbooks and not teach them as history. We have to acknowledge that they happened.
Yeah, and you talked about reparations there. Well, survivors of the massacre, and there aren't that many of them, sadly, they're amongst the plaintiffs in this lawsuit seeking this. What could reparations do?
Well, I think first off, let's make sure that we note this all started because of a 19-year-old young man who was getting on an elevator who accidentally touched a white woman who screamed out. And there were reports that he had run off. And so because of that incident, thousands of businesses were destroyed. Depending on what estimates you look at, they say between 55 and 300 African Americans were killed. So there are a lot of those descendants of those people who were impacted, and thousands of businesses within a 35 square block radius were destroyed. So in terms of when we talk about reparations, you're talking about reparations for people who are descendants who lost out, because there were a great deal of African Americans in that area who were millionaires, who were prospering, that were thriving within a system of what we call Jim Crow, which was racial discrimination. So how reparations comes about, it's not, reparations doesn't come back to erase what happened. It just is something that happened that we hope that will come about to acknowledge that it happened. So again, so that we have this conversation and we make sure that people never forget, so that it doesn't repeat itself, because in some way we keep seeing it happen, whether or not it's in our healthcare system, whether or not it's in unemployment, whether or not it's in financing to try and buy a home. These things systemically are still within our society.
Absolutely. Events like this need to be remembered. Thank you so much, Mr. Atiba Maduun, President and founder of Party Politics. Appreciate it.